The bicycle wheels were still spinning when 15-year-old Julie Ann Hansen disappeared into the Illinois summer heat on July 15, 1972. In the quiet Chicago suburb of Naperville, population 12,000, that Saturday afternoon arrived with a kind of sweltering warmth that made children seek shade and mothers open every window in the house. At 3:47 p.m., Julie's brother reluctantly handed over his prized Schwinn bicycle, watching his sister pedal away in her favorite yellow sundress toward what should have been an ordinary birthday party celebration. Mrs. Dorothy Kelvin from across Elm Street had waved from her garden as Julie coasted past the neat rows of ranch houses that defined their neighborhood. The elderly woman watched Julie's blonde ponytail bounce against her shoulders, her smile bright as she navigated around the Mitchells' parked Buick. That cheerful wave would become the last confirmed sighting of Julie alive. What happened in the next 14 hours would shatter Naperville's carefully constructed sense of suburban safety forever. By dawn on Sunday, July 16th, Julie's twisted bicycle lay abandoned in a field 3 miles from home, its chrome handlebars catching the early morning light like a beacon of tragedy. Nearby, hidden in the tall grass that swayed gently in the summer breeze, police would discover Julie's body stabbed multiple times, her life violently stolen by someone who had walked among their community undetected. The killer had committed the perfect crime, vanishing into the fabric of small-town America while a family and an entire community began their descent into a nightmare that would last 49 years. But evil has a way of leaving traces, and time has a way of revealing truth. Even when justice seems impossibly distant, even when hope fades into bitter memory, sometimes persistence and science can reach across decades to finally answer one haunting question: who killed Julie Ann Hansen? Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. The morning of July 15, 1972, dawned clear and bright in Naperville, Illinois. The suburban streets hummed with the familiar rhythm of Saturday routines, lawn mowers cutting precise lines through green yards, children's laughter echoing from backyards, and the distant sound of the Rock Island Railroad carrying commuters toward Chicago's gleaming skyline 28 miles to the east. Julie Ann Hansen stood in her family's kitchen, wearing her favorite yellow sundress with tiny white flowers embroidered along the neckline. At 15, she possessed the kind of natural beauty that belonged to small-town American summers: blonde hair that caught sunlight like spun gold, blue eyes that sparkled with mischief and kindness in equal measure, and a smile that could dissolve any argument her younger brother might start. "Mom, can I help you with anything before I go?" Julie asked, watching Mrs. Hansen arrange fresh daisies in a mason jar. The Hansen home on Elm Street was modest but immaculate, filled with the kind of comfortable furniture that spoke of careful budgeting and genuine love. Family photographs lined the mantelpiece above a fireplace that would crackle with warmth come winter. "You're such a good girl," Mrs. Hansen replied, pausing to smooth Julie's ponytail. "Just be home by 6 for dinner. Your father's grilling hamburgers." Julie's brother sat at the kitchen table, methodically eating his way through a stack of pancakes while reading the sports section of the Chicago Tribune. The Cubs were having another disappointing season, but hope springs eternal in the hearts of 12-year-old boys and baseball fans alike. "Hey, can I borrow your bike?" Julie asked, knowing the answer before she asked. Her brother's Schwinn was his most prized possession, a metallic blue beauty with chrome handlebars and a banana seat that made every ride feel like an adventure. He looked up from his pancakes, syrup dripping from his fork. "I guess, but don't scratch it." Julie grinned and kissed his forehead, leaving him blushing and annoyed in equal measure. The Schwinn bicycle gleamed in the afternoon sun as Julie wheeled it from the garage, its chrome handlebars reflecting the cloudless July sky. The bike was slightly too large for her, requiring her to stretch to reach the pedals comfortably, but she had ridden it dozens of times before. Neighborhood kids often shared bicycles like library books, a currency of friendship and trust that bound Elm Street together. Julie's yellow sundress fluttered in the warm breeze as she adjusted the seat and checked the handbrakes. The dress was new, purchased just 2 weeks earlier for the summer church socials that marked the rhythm of suburban life. She had chosen it herself from Montgomery Ward, loving the way the fabric felt soft against her skin and how the color made her feel sunny and confident. "Remember, straight to Sarah's house and straight back," Mrs. Hansen called from the front porch, shading her eyes with her hand. "No detours to the ice cream stand." "I promise, Mom." Julie's voice carried that mixture of affection and mild exasperation that mothers know so well. At 15, she was caught between childhood and adulthood, still young enough to need permission, but old enough to crave independence. She pushed off from the curb with her right foot, then swung her leg over the banana seat with practiced ease. The bicycle responded smoothly as she pedaled down Elm Street, past houses where neighbors worked in gardens or sat on porch swings with glasses of iced tea. Mrs. Kelvin waved from her rose garden, where she spent most summer afternoons tending to flowers that had won ribbons at the county fair 3 years running. The ride to Sarah's house would take her through the heart of Naperville's residential district, past the elementary school where she had learned to read, past the park where she had played countless games of tag, and finally to the modest ranch house where her friend's birthday celebration awaited. It was a journey she had made hundreds of times, as familiar and safe as breathing. 6 o'clock came and went without Julie's familiar voice calling, "I'm home," from the front door. Mr. Hansen stood at the gas grill in the backyard, watching hamburger patties sizzle while glancing repeatedly at his Timex watch. The smell of charcoal and cooking meat filled the evening air, mixing with the scent of honeysuckle that grew along their back fence. "She's probably just having fun and lost track of time," Mrs. Hansen said, though her voice carried a note of uncertainty that hadn't been there an hour earlier. She had set the picnic table with their everyday dishes, white plates with blue trim that they'd received as a wedding gift 15 years ago. Julie's place sat empty, the folded napkin waiting patiently beside unused silverware. Their son bounced a rubber ball against the garage door with mechanical precision, each thud marking another minute of Julie's absence. "She better not have wrecked my bike," he muttered, but his complaint lacked conviction. Deep down, he was beginning to worry too, though he couldn't articulate why. By 7:30, the hamburgers had grown cold. Mrs. Hansen wrapped them in aluminum foil and placed them in the refrigerator, her movements sharp with growing anxiety. She had called Sarah's house 3 times, but the phone rang unanswered. The family had likely gone out for birthday dinner at a restaurant. "I'm going to drive around and look for her," Mr. Hansen announced, wiping his hands on a dish towel. He worked construction during the week, his hands permanently stained with traces of dirt and honest labor. Those same hands now fumbled with his car keys, betraying nerves he tried to hide from his wife and son. The sun was setting behind the elm trees that gave their street its name, casting long shadows across manicured lawns where automatic sprinklers had begun their evening cycle. Naperville was settling into its Saturday night routine, but the Hansen house felt suspended in an uncomfortable silence, broken only by the tick of the kitchen clock marking each passing minute of Julie's absence. By dawn on Sunday, July 16th, the Hansen home had become an unofficial command center. Neighbors arrived with coffee in thermoses and sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, their faces drawn with concern and determination. Sleep had been impossible. Mrs. Hansen had spent the night calling every friend Julie might have visited, while Mr. Hansen had driven the dark streets of Naperville until his eyes burned with exhaustion. The Naperville Police Department had been notified at 11:47 p.m. Saturday night, though protocol required waiting longer before officially classifying Julie as a missing person. Deputy Wallace, a soft-spoken man with 3 daughters of his own, had taken the report with careful attention to detail that both comforted and terrified Julie's parents. "We'll find her," he had promised, but the words felt hollow in the pre-dawn darkness. Now, as pink light crept across the horizon, volunteer searchers gathered in the Hansens' front yard. Church members, co-workers, and neighbors formed groups of 4 or 5, each assigned to cover specific areas of Naperville's expanding residential districts. Some carried flashlights despite the growing daylight. Others brought walking sticks to probe tall grass and dense brush. Mrs. Kelvin approached Mrs. Hansen with a mason jar of black coffee and a gentle hand on her shoulder. "We're going to bring her home, dear," she said, with the kind of faith that only longtime neighbors can provide. Her rose garden seemed forgotten as she prepared to join the search effort. The search grid expanded methodically outward from Sarah's house, where the birthday party had indeed taken place, but Julie had never arrived. Sarah's mother had called the Hansens at 4 p.m. Saturday, concerned when Julie didn't show up for cake and ice cream. That phone call had been the first crack in the foundation of normalcy. Now, as Sunday morning light revealed dew-heavy grass and empty fields beyond Naperville's neighborhoods, the search teams moved with purpose and growing dread. Each step took them further from hope and closer to answers they didn't want to find. Officer Martinez spotted the bicycle first, his metallic blue frame partially hidden in tall grass near the edge of Morrison's cornfield. The Schwinn lay on its side like a wounded animal, one wheel still spinning lazily in the morning breeze. Chrome handlebars that had gleamed with pride just 18 hours earlier now caught sunlight like a cry for help. "Over here!" Martinez called to his partner, Officer Reynolds, who was searching the irrigation ditch 30 yards away. The cornfield stretched for acres in every direction, green stalks standing shoulder-high in neat rows that would yield a harvest of grain, and now tragedy. Reynolds approached cautiously, his trained eyes taking in details that would later become crucial evidence. The bicycle showed signs of having been thrown or dropped with force. The front wheel was bent, and the chain had come off its gears. Julie's small purse lay nearby, its contents scattered across the summer earth like breadcrumbs leading nowhere. "Call for backup," Reynolds said quietly, "and the coroner." They found Julie's body 15 feet from the bicycle, hidden in grass that would have concealed her completely from anyone passing on the nearby farm road. She lay on her side, still wearing the yellow sundress that had made her feel confident and beautiful just one day earlier. The dress was torn and stained with blood that had darkened to rust in the overnight hours. Multiple stab wounds marked her small frame, wounds that spoke of rage and violence incomprehensible in this peaceful corner of Illinois. Someone had attacked her with savage intensity, then left her to die alone in a field where corn grew straight and tall under an indifferent sky. Officer Martinez, a father himself, had to step away to collect himself. In his 5 years with the Naperville Police Department, he had responded to traffic accidents and domestic disputes, but never to anything like this. The innocence of the scene, summer morning, growing crops, a child's bicycle, made the violence feel even more obscene and impossible to comprehend. Detective Frank Morrison, no relation to the farmer who owned the field, sat across from Mr. and Mrs. Hanson at their kitchen table, the same table where Julie had eaten breakfast less than 24 hours earlier. The morning sunlight streaming through gingham curtains seemed inappropriately cheerful given the news he had to deliver. "I'm sorry," he began, his voice steady despite the weight of his words. "We found Julie this morning. She's gone." The words hit Mrs. Hanson like physical blows. She doubled over in her chair, a sound escaping her throat that was part sob, part scream, part denial of reality itself. Mr. Hanson reached for her instinctively, his calloused hand finding her shoulder as his own face crumpled with grief that would never fully heal. Julie's brother stood in the kitchen doorway, still wearing pajamas decorated with cartoon cowboys. At 12, he was old enough to understand death, but too young to process the sudden, violent theft of his sister's life. "It's my fault," he whispered. "I let her borrow my bike." "No, son," Detective Morrison said firmly. "This is not your fault, not in any way." But the boy would carry that burden for decades, along with the memory of his sister kissing his forehead before she rode away forever. Neighbors began arriving as word spread through Naperville's tight-knit community. Mrs. Kelvin came first, still wearing the gardening apron she'd put on to tend her roses before learning that roses no longer mattered. She brought a casserole that would go uneaten, and tears that would fall freely. The kitchen filled with quiet voices and gentle hands, church ladies who knew the language of grief, neighbors who brought food and flowers, men who stood awkwardly in corners because they didn't know what to do with their own sorrow. Julie's empty chair at the table became the center of everything, a focal point of absence that drew every eye and broke every heart. Outside, police cars lined Elm Street, their presence transforming a suburban paradise into a crime scene that would haunt this community forever. By Monday morning, Julie Ann Hanson's photograph stared back from every bulletin board, shop window, and telephone pole in Naperville. The picture of her junior high school portrait from the previous spring showed her wearing a pale blue sweater and that radiant smile that had lit up every room she entered. Now that same smile became a rallying cry for justice and a daily reminder that evil had walked among them. Detective Morrison pinned Julie's photograph to the case board in the police station's main conference room, where it joined maps of the search area, witness statements, and evidence photographs that told the story of her final hours. The board would grow over the coming weeks as investigators followed every possible lead, but Julie's face would remain at its center, a 15-year-old girl whose life had been cut short by someone who remained invisible. Principal Henderson called an emergency assembly at Naperville High School, where Julie would have been a sophomore in the fall. Students sat in stunned silence as guidance counselors spoke about grief and fear, offering resources that seemed inadequate against the magnitude of loss. Julie's best friends held each other and cried openly, while boys who had harbored secret crushes on her struggled with emotions they couldn't name. Churches throughout DuPage County held special services, their congregations praying for Julie's family and for the capture of whoever had committed this unthinkable crime. Pastor Williams at First Methodist spoke about lambs and shepherds, about good and evil, about faith tested by incomprehensible tragedy. His words provided comfort to some and rang hollow to others who couldn't reconcile a loving God with a dead child. Local businesses posted reward notices in their windows. $500, 0 cents from the hardware store, $200, 0 cents from Sally's Beauty Salon, $100, 0 cents from teenagers who emptied their summer job savings accounts. The money represented more than financial incentive. It was a community's desperate attempt to buy justice, to prove that good people outnumbered the evil ones, and that truth would somehow prevail over darkness. 3 weeks into the investigation, Detective Morrison's chalkboard told a story of false starts and dead ends. Names appeared and disappeared like ghosts. Suspicious individuals who had been questioned, cleared, and eliminated from consideration. Each erasure felt like a small defeat, another step away from justice for Julie and her grieving family. Harold Kowalski, a traveling salesman who had been in the area that weekend, had seemed promising until his alibi checked out completely. He had been 60 miles away at a trade convention, surrounded by witnesses and caught on film at the hotel's evening banquet. The chalkboard name disappeared under Detective Morrison's eraser, leaving only white dust and continued frustration. Timothy Walsh, a recent parolee with a history of violence against women, had also warranted investigation, but Walsh had been in Chicago that entire weekend, visiting his parole officer and attending mandatory counseling sessions. Another name erased, another theory abandoned. Even Julie's own neighbors had been scrutinized with the kind of uncomfortable thoroughness that murder investigations demand. Mr. Peterson, the recently divorced man who lived alone 3 houses down, had endured hours of questioning about his whereabouts Saturday afternoon. His nervousness had made him seem guilty of something, but that something turned out to be an affair with a married woman, embarrassing but not criminal. The forensic evidence provided tantalizingly few clues. Fingerprints on Julie's bicycle were either smudged beyond recognition or belonged to Julie herself and her brother. No witnesses had seen anything unusual Saturday afternoon. No strange cars, no suspicious individuals, no signs of struggle until the terrible discovery Sunday morning. Detective Morrison sat in his office as another evening fell on Naperville, staring at a case file that seemed to mock his efforts. Somewhere in this peaceful community, a killer was living a normal life, perhaps going to work, eating dinner with family, sleeping soundly while Julie's parents lay awake staring at the ceiling. The worst part was that the killer might be someone Morrison had already questioned and dismissed, someone hiding in plain sight behind a mask of suburban respectability. Winter came early to Naperville in 1972, blanketing the town in snow that seemed to muffle not just sound but hope itself. Julie's bicycle, which had remained outside the Hansen home as a kind of shrine, gradually disappeared under layers of white that transformed it into an abstract sculpture of grief and abandonment. Mrs. Hansen stood at her kitchen window, watching snow fall on the empty bike rack where Julie's own bicycle should have been parked. They had never bought her a bike, had been planning to for her 16th birthday in December. Now that birthday would pass unmarked except by tears and the kind of silence that grows heavy in houses where laughter used to live. Detective Morrison's case file had grown thick with witness statements, forensic reports, and investigative dead ends. The Illinois State Police had assisted with broader searches and database comparisons, but Julie's killer seemed to have vanished as completely as if he had never existed. Tips continued to trickle in, a suspicious man seen at a gas station, a car spotted in unusual places, but each lead crumbled under scrutiny. The Naperville Police Department held its annual Christmas party that December, but the celebration felt forced and hollow. Julie's photograph remained on the caseboard, now accompanied by other unsolved crimes that had accumulated over the months. Detective Morrison found himself staring at her smile during quiet moments, wondering if he had missed something crucial, some detail that might have led to an arrest. Julie's funeral had been held in October, when autumn leaves turned the colors of fire and gold. Half the town had attended, packing First Methodist Church until mourners stood along the walls and spilled onto the front steps. Her white casket had been covered with yellow roses, hundreds of them, sent by people who had never met her, but felt connected to her story through their own fears and love for their children. Now winter held the town in its grip, and Julie's case grew as cold as the Illinois wind. By 1985, Naperville had transformed from a sleepy railroad town into a booming suburb, its population swelling to over 42,000 as Chicago's sprawl reached westward like grasping fingers. New subdivisions sprouted where cornfields had once grown, their winding streets named for trees and flowers that had been bulldozed to make room for progress. But in the Hansen household, time had stopped on July 15, 1972. Julie's bedroom remained exactly as she had left it 13 years earlier. The yellow bedspread smoothed over her single bed, Nancy Drew mysteries lined up on painted shelves, and a small mirror reflecting an emptiness that had settled into the walls themselves. Mrs. Hansen dusted the room weekly, a ritual that had become both meditation and torment. Mr. Hansen had aged decades in those 13 years. His thick black hair turned completely gray, and his hands, once strong from construction work, now trembled slightly when he held his coffee cup. He had changed jobs twice, unable to concentrate on blueprints and building permits when his mind constantly wandered to questions that had no answers. Where was the man who had killed his daughter? Was he still in Naperville, walking the same streets, shopping in the same stores? Julie's brother had graduated high school and enlisted in the army, choosing a path that would take him far from the memories that haunted Elm Street. He wrote letters home filled with careful cheerfulness, but never mentioned Julie's name. The guilt he carried had hardened into a kind of protective shell that kept people at a distance. Detective Morrison had retired in 1981, handing Julie's case file to Detective Sarah Coleman with a mixture of relief and regret. Coleman was young, ambitious, and convinced that fresh eyes might spot something her predecessor had missed. She spent her first 6 months reading every report, re-interviewing key witnesses, and studying crime scene photographs until Julie's face appeared in her dreams. But the case remained stubbornly, heartbreakingly cold. The 1990s brought revolutionary changes to criminal investigation, and Detective Coleman watched with growing excitement as DNA technology evolved from experimental science to standard forensic practice. The O.J. Simpson trial had made genetic evidence a household term, and police departments across Illinois began revisiting cold cases with renewed hope. Detective Coleman carefully inventoried the physical evidence from Julie's murder, cataloging items that had been stored in the department's evidence room for over 20 years. A small piece of fabric from Julie's torn dress, hair samples that might have come from her attacker, biological evidence that 1972 technology couldn't analyze but that modern science might unlock like a genetic time capsule. The Illinois State Police Crime Laboratory in Springfield had acquired new DNA analysis equipment, machines that could extract genetic profiles from evidence samples that would have been useless just 5 years earlier. Coleman submitted Julie's evidence with hands that shook slightly, not from nerves, but from anticipation that had been building for months. The results came back on a cold February morning in 1996. The lab had successfully extracted a partial DNA profile from biological evidence found at the crime scene, a genetic fingerprint that belonged to Julie's killer. For the first time in nearly 24 years, investigators had something concrete to work with, a scientific tool that could definitively link a suspect to the crime. But the profile sat alone in a database that was still in its infancy. DNA evidence was only useful if there was something to compare it against, and in 1996, criminal DNA databases contained fewer than 10,000 profiles nationwide. Julie's killer would have to be arrested for another crime and forced to provide a DNA sample before science could make the connection. Coleman called Mrs. Hanson with the news, explaining carefully that they now had the killer's genetic signature but still needed to find the man it belonged to. "We're closer than we've ever been," she promised, but close in a cold case can still mean years or even decades away. Christmas 1999 arrived with an unusual warmth that turned snow to slush and filled the Hanson house with a melancholy that seemed deeper than usual. Julie would have been 42 years old, perhaps married with children of her own, perhaps living in one of the new subdivisions that had transformed Naperville beyond recognition. Instead, she remained forever 15 in family photographs and increasingly fragile memories. Mrs. Hanson, now 71, moved more slowly through holiday preparations that had once brought such joy. She still baked Julie's favorite cookies, sugar cookies cut into star shapes and decorated with yellow icing, though no one in the family could bear to eat them. They were placed on the kitchen counter like offerings, growing stale while cardinals pecked at seeds outside the window where Julie had once watched for the school bus. Julie's brother had married and divorced, unable to sustain relationships that required the kind of emotional vulnerability he had locked away decades earlier. He visited his parents dutifully during holidays, bringing gifts that felt heavy with unspoken grief and sitting in the living room where Julie's high school graduation photograph watched from the mantelpiece, a celebration that had never occurred. On Christmas Eve, the family gathered around their artificial tree, its lights blinking in patterns that had remained unchanged since 1972. Mr. Hanson read from the Gospel of Luke, his voice wavering on passages about shepherds and newborn hope. When he reached the part about Mary treasuring things in her heart, Mrs. Hanson began to cry quietly, thinking of all the treasures she had stored up from 15 brief years with her daughter. The ritual they had developed over the decades continued. After midnight services at First Methodist, they would drive to Naperville Cemetery and place a small Christmas tree by Julie's headstone. The granite marker bore the simple inscription, Julie Ann Hanson, beloved daughter, 1957-1972, but gave no hint of the mystery that had consumed 3 decades of their lives, or the hope that still flickered like a candle in an endless winter. The new millennium brought digital archives and internet databases to the Naperville Police Department, transforming how cold cases were stored and accessed. Julie's case file, once contained in manila folders and cardboard boxes, was carefully digitized and uploaded to state databases where it joined thousands of other unsolved crimes, waiting for advances in technology or witnesses willing to break decades of silence. Local newspapers marking Naperville's sesquicentennial in 2001 featured retrospective articles about the community's growth and change. Invariably, these pieces included references to Julie's murder, the crime that had shattered the town's innocence and remained its most notorious unsolved case. New residents, drawn to Naperville's excellent schools and low crime rates, would read these articles with a mixture of fascination and unease, suddenly aware that evil could strike anywhere. The Naperville Historical Society received a donation that year from an unexpected source, Mrs. Kelvin, now in her 90s and preparing to move to assisted living. Among the items she contributed was a scrapbook she had maintained for nearly 30 years, filled with newspaper clippings, photographs from vigils, and handwritten notes about the case. Her meticulous record-keeping had preserved details that might otherwise have been forgotten, creating an unofficial archive of community grief and resilience. Detective Coleman, now a lieutenant with the department, occasionally received calls from amateur investigators and true crime enthusiasts who had discovered Julie's case through internet research. Most were well-meaning but unhelpful, offering theories based on incomplete information or circumstantial connections that led nowhere. But she listened to each caller carefully, knowing that sometimes the most unlikely source could provide the crucial detail that breaks a case wide open. Julie's photograph had faded slightly over the years, but it still occupied a place of honor on the cold case board. New crimes had joined it, other unsolved mysteries that haunted different families, but Julie's case remained the department's most enduring failure and its greatest hope for eventual justice. In 2018, forensic genetic genealogy emerged as a revolutionary tool that would transform cold case investigations forever. The Golden State Killer's capture through DNA and public genealogy databases sent shockwaves through law enforcement agencies nationwide, including the Naperville Police Department, where Lieutenant Coleman had been waiting for exactly this kind of breakthrough. The technology worked by uploading crime scene DNA profiles to public genealogy websites like GEDmatch, where they could be compared against millions of genetic profiles submitted by people researching their family histories. Matches with distant relatives could be used to construct family trees that eventually led investigators to potential suspects, a process that required weeks or months of painstaking genealogical detective work. Lieutenant Coleman contacted the Illinois State Police Crime Laboratory about submitting Julie's case to their new forensic genetic genealogy program. The lab's genetic genealogist, Dr. Sarah Martinez, specialized in building family trees from DNA evidence and had already solved 3 cold cases using the technique. She agreed to take on Julie's case, warning that the process could take months and might not yield results if the killer's relatives hadn't submitted their DNA to public databases. A genetic profile extracted from Julie's case in 1996 was uploaded to GEDmatch in September 2018. Joining millions of other DNA profiles in a vast digital repository of human genetic information. Within days, the system identified several partial matches, people who shared enough genetic material with Julie's attacker to be distant relatives, perhaps third or fourth cousins. Dr. Martinez began the painstaking process of building family trees backward from these matches, using genealogical records, census data, and historical documents to map genetic relationships across multiple generations. Each tree grew like a river system in reverse, tributaries of ancestry flowing backward through time toward common ancestors who had lived in the 1800s. Somewhere in those branching family connections was the answer to a question that had haunted Naperville for 46 years. The killer's DNA was finally ready to tell its story, if science could teach it to speak. On March 15, 2019, Dr. Martinez called Lieutenant Coleman with news that made her hands tremble as she reached for a pen. The genetic genealogy analysis had identified a cluster of family trees that converged on a promising suspect, a man whose age, location, and family history aligned perfectly with the crime. The suspect's name was Barry Welpley, and in 1972 he had been 27 years old, unmarried, and living on Maple Street in Naperville, just 6 blocks from the Hanson family home. He had worked as a welder at Caterpillar's Aurora facility, a job that required him to be precise, methodical, and comfortable with sharp tools. More importantly, he had no solid alibi for the afternoon and evening of July 15, 1972. Public records showed that Welpley had left Illinois in 1975, relocating to Minnesota where he had married, raised 2 children, and lived quietly in the Minneapolis suburb of Mounds View. Now 74 years old, he was retired and widowed, his wife having died of cancer in 2014. To his neighbors, he was simply Barry, a polite, somewhat reclusive man who kept his yard immaculate and rarely spoke about his past. The genetic evidence was compelling but not definitive. Dr. Martinez explained that the DNA profile suggested Barry Welpley was the source with a high degree of probability, but legal confirmation would require a direct comparison with a fresh DNA sample. That meant surveillance, investigation, and eventually an arrest. Lieutenant Coleman assembled a task force of detectives who began quietly investigating Welpley's background. They discovered he had been questioned briefly in 1972 as part of the neighborhood canvassing but had been dismissed as a routine interview. His name appeared nowhere in the extensive case files, a ghost who had hidden in plain sight for nearly 50 years. The investigation moved carefully, methodically, with the patience that cold case work demanded. After 47 years, they could afford to wait a few more weeks to build an airtight case. Detective Michael Torres flew to Minneapolis in May 2019, tasked with conducting surveillance on Barry Welpley and gathering evidence for an arrest warrant. The suburban neighborhood of Mounds View felt eerily similar to the Naperville of 1972. Quiet streets lined with modest homes, children playing in front yards, the comfortable anonymity of middle-class America. Welpley's house on Cedar Lane was unremarkable in every way. A tan rambler with white shutters, a small garden where tomatoes grew in neat rows, and a mailbox painted to match the house trim. Neighbors described him as quiet but friendly, the kind of man who waved when he retrieved his mail and always cleared snow from the sidewalk without being asked. Torres observed Welpley's daily routines from an unmarked van parked discreetly down the block. The elderly man emerged each morning at 7:30 a.m. to collect his newspaper, moving slowly but steadily despite his age. He drove a well-maintained Honda Civic to the grocery store twice a week, always using the same parking space near the shopping cart return. His life appeared to follow patterns established over decades, the kind of rigid routine that suggested either careful planning or deep-seated anxiety. The surveillance revealed no obvious signs of guilt or suspicious behavior, but Torres hadn't expected any. If Welpley was indeed Julie's killer, he had spent nearly 50 years perfecting the art of appearing normal, of blending into communities where his presence raised no questions and triggered no memories. On May 23rd, Torres watched Welpley tend his garden, carefully weeding around tomato plants that were just beginning to flower. The scene was almost pastoral, an elderly man finding peace in simple tasks, surrounded by the suburban tranquility he had cultivated for decades. But Torres knew that if the DNA evidence was correct, those same hands had once held a knife that had ended a 15-year-old girl's life with savage brutality. The arrest warrant was signed on June 1, 2021, exactly 48 years, 10 months, and 17 days after Julie Ann Hansen had borrowed her brother's bicycle for the last time. At 6:47 a.m. on June 8, 2021, Detective Torres knocked on Barry Welpley's front door while backup officers positioned themselves around the perimeter of the house. The arrest had been planned for early morning when the neighborhood was quiet and Welpley would likely be alone, minimizing the risk of flight or confrontation. Welpley answered the door wearing a blue terry cloth bathrobe and slippers, his white hair disheveled from sleep. At 76, he appeared frail and confused, squinting at the badge Torres held up for identification. "Mr. Barry Lee Welpley?" Torres asked, his voice steady despite the significance of the moment. "Yes, that's me," Welpley replied, his Minnesota accent carrying traces of the Illinois inflection he had never completely lost. "What's this about?" "You're under arrest for the murder of Julie Ann Hansen in Naperville, Illinois, on July 15, 1972. The words Torres had practiced dozens of times felt surreal as he spoke them aloud. Nearly 50 years of investigation had led to this moment. An elderly man in a bathrobe standing in a doorway where morning newspapers lay scattered on a welcome mat that read, "Bless this home." Welpley's reaction was subtle but telling. His face didn't register surprise or confusion, the natural responses of an innocent man falsely accused. Instead, his shoulders sagged slightly, as if a weight he had carried for decades was finally settling into its proper place. "I think I need to call my lawyer," he said quietly. The handcuffs clicked close around wrists that had grown thin and spotted with age. Neighbors emerged from their houses in bathrobes and pajamas, watching in stunned silence as their quiet, reliable neighbor was led to a police car. Mrs. Henderson from across the street would later tell reporters that she had never suspected anything unusual about Barry, that he had been the perfect neighbor, helpful, polite, and utterly forgettable, which Torres realized had probably been exactly the point. The news broke across Illinois like wildfire. "Naperville cold case solved after 49 years, screamed headlines from Chicago to Springfield, while local television stations interrupted regular programming to report the arrest that had shocked both Minnesota and Illinois law enforcement communities. Julie's surviving family members, now in their 60s and 70s, gathered at the old house on Elm Street where reporters had begun congregating like migrating birds drawn by an ancient instinct. Mrs. Hansen had died in 2003, her husband following her in 2007, both having carried their grief to graves marked by headstones that mentioned their beloved daughter. They had never lived to see this day, a cruel irony that added bittersweet complexity to the family's relief. Julie's brother, now 59 and a retired electrician living in Arizona, flew back to Illinois for the first time in over a decade. The house where he had grown up felt smaller than he remembered, filled with furniture that belonged to the 1970s and photographs that had faded to sepia tones. His sister's bedroom remained exactly as she had left it, preserved by parents who had refused to accept that she would never come home. "We knew this day would come eventually," he told the cameras assembled on his childhood street, his voice steady despite the tears that threatened to fall. "My parents never gave up hope, even when it seemed impossible. They would have been so happy to know that Julie's killer was finally caught." The sister, who had become the family's spokesperson, spoke about the strange mixture of relief and sorrow that comes with delayed justice. "We're grateful to everyone who never forgot Julie," she said, "the detectives who kept working her case, the scientists who developed the technology that solved it, and the community that kept her memory alive. But we're also sad that our parents didn't live to see this day. They deserved to know the truth." Booth County Courthouse had seen thousands of criminal cases during its long history, but few had carried the weight of People v. Barry Lee Welpley. On August 15, 2021, Welpley appeared for his arraignment wearing an orange jail jumpsuit that hung loosely on his diminished frame. The man who had once been strong enough to overpower and kill a 15-year-old girl now needed assistance walking to the defendant's table. Judge Patricia Williams presided over proceedings that felt surreal in their mundane formality. Welpley's attorney, a court-appointed public defender named James Morrison, no relation to the long-retired detective, entered a plea of not guilty to charges of first-degree murder, crimes that had been committed before he was born. The courtroom was packed with observers who had followed the case for decades. Retired police officers who had worked the original investigation sat beside Julie's classmates, now approaching their 70s, their faces marked by time but their memories of her still sharp. True crime enthusiasts who had discovered the case through podcasts and internet forums occupied the back rows, drawn by the rare opportunity to witness the resolution of a case they had studied obsessively. Prosecutor Elizabeth Santos outlined the state's case in measured tones that belied the groundbreaking nature of the evidence. The DNA profile extracted from the 1972 crime scene matched Welpley's genetic signature with a probability that exceeded 99.9%. Forensic genetic genealogy had provided the investigative lead, but traditional DNA analysis would provide the courtroom proof. Welpley's defender argued that genetic evidence alone, no matter how sophisticated, could not overcome the practical challenges of prosecuting a 50-year-old crime. Witnesses were dead, memories had faded, and physical evidence had degraded beyond the standards expected in modern criminal trials. Judge Williams set a trial date for March 2022, nearly 50 years after Julie's murder. "This case will proceed," she announced, her gavel echoing through a courtroom where justice had waited longer than most people live. On a crisp October morning in 2021, Julie's surviving family members made their way to Naperville Cemetery for the first time since her parents' funerals. The cemetery had expanded significantly since 1972, new sections added to accommodate the suburban growth that had transformed their small town into a bustling city of over 140,000 residents. Julie's grave lay in the original section, beneath an oak tree that had grown tall and stately over the decades. Her headstone, made of gray granite that had weathered to a soft patina, still bore fresh flowers, yellow roses placed there monthly by a volunteer group from First Methodist Church. The women who tended her grave were mostly strangers to Julie's family, church members who had never met her but felt connected to her story through their own love for their children and grandchildren. Julie's sister knelt beside the headstone and placed her palm flat against the cool stone. "We found him, Julie," she whispered, her voice carrying across grass where morning dew still sparkled like scattered diamonds. "It took 50 years, but we found the man who hurt you." Her brother stood with his hands clasped behind his back, staring at the dates etched in granite. 1957, 1972. 15 years of life reduced to a span of numbers that seemed impossibly brief. He thought about all the experiences Julie had never had. Graduation, marriage, children, the simple joy of growing old. The man who had stolen those experiences was now sitting in a jail cell, finally facing consequences that had been delayed by half a century. "I still feel guilty about the bicycle," he admitted to his sister. "I know it's not logical, but I can't shake the feeling that if I hadn't let her borrow it, she would have found another way to get to that party," his sister replied firmly. "You were a good brother. You gave her something that made her happy. That's what she would remember." They stood in comfortable silence as autumn leaves fell around them like confetti celebrating delayed justice. Naperville's annual Riverwalk dedication in September 2021 took on special significance as the community reflected on how far it had traveled from the small railroad town where Julie Ann Hansen had lived and died. The ceremony, held along the DuPage River, where Julie had once played as a child, drew hundreds of residents who had followed her case through 5 decades of silence and, finally, resolution. Mayor Sarah Rodriguez spoke about the importance of community memory and the persistence required to achieve justice across generations. Julie's case reminds us that some wounds take decades to heal, but they can heal, she told the assembled crowd. Our community never forgot her, and that remembrance ultimately led to this breakthrough. A candlelight vigil was organized for sunset, with participants gathering in the pavilion where summer concerts drew families to spread blankets and listen to music under the stars. Each person held a small white candle as darkness settled over the river, their flames flickering in the evening breeze like prayers made visible. Mrs. Patterson, who had been Julie's Sunday school teacher at First Methodist, spoke on behalf of the church community that had never stopped praying for justice. At 87, she moved slowly to the podium, but her voice remained strong as she read from Ecclesiastes. To everything there is a season, and a time to every purpose under heaven, a time to keep silence, and a time to speak. The vigil concluded with participants floating small paper boats down the DuPage River, each one carrying a written message to Julie or her family. Children who had been born decades after her death participated alongside adults who remembered her personally, creating a bridge between past and present that felt sacred in its simple beauty. As the boats disappeared around the river's bend, carried by currents that had flowed through Naperville long before Julie was born and would continue long after justice was finally served, the community felt something it hadn't experienced in 50 years: closure. Lieutenant Coleman stood before the annual conference of the International Association of Cold Case Investigators, Julie's case file in her hands like a testament to patience and perseverance. The folder, now thick with 5 decades of reports, interviews, and scientific analysis, represented both the frustration and ultimate triumph of cold case investigation. The lesson of Julie Ann Hansen's case, Coleman told the assembled detectives from across North America, is that we must never accept the word never when it comes to seeking justice. Technology that didn't exist when she was murdered provided the breakthrough that solved her case. Evidence that seemed useless in 1972 became the key to her killer's arrest in 2021. The audience included investigators working cases even older than Julie's, murders from the 1960s and 1950s, where evidence had been carefully preserved against the day when science might catch up to justice. Coleman's presentation offered hope to detectives who had inherited cold cases from retired colleagues who spent their days reviewing files that seemed to resist every investigative technique. Dr. Martinez, the genetic genealogist who had identified Barry Whelpley, spoke about the rapid evolution of forensic technology. Techniques that seemed like science fiction just a few years earlier were now standard tools in the cold case investigator's arsenal. DNA phenotyping could predict a suspect's physical appearance from genetic evidence, while forensic genetic genealogy could identify suspects through their distant relatives' DNA profiles. We're entering an era where the passage of time may actually work in favor of solving cold cases rather than against them, Dr. Martinez explained. As more people submit their DNA to genealogical databases, our ability to make connections across family trees continues to expand exponentially. Coleman closed her presentation with Julie's high school photograph projected on the screen behind her. "This young woman waited 49 years for justice," she said, "but she got it. That should give hope to every family still waiting, and determination to every investigator still searching for answers." The trial of Barry Whelpley opened on March 14, 2022, in a DuPage County courtroom filled with observers who represented 5 decades of grief, hope, and determination. Julie's family occupied the front row, their faces showing the complex emotions that come with justice delayed but not denied. Behind them sat retired police officers, former classmates, and community members who had carried Julie's memory through half a century of unanswered questions. Whelpley, now 77 and noticeably frail, sat beside his attorney with an expression that revealed nothing. He had aged into the kind of elderly man that society views with automatic sympathy, white-haired, soft-spoken, seemingly harmless, but the evidence presented over the next 2 weeks painted a different picture of who he had been in 1972. Prosecutor Santos methodically built her case around the DNA evidence that had made the trial possible. Dr. Martinez testified about the genetic genealogy process that had identified Whelpley as a suspect, while forensic scientists explained how direct DNA comparison had confirmed the match with probability exceeding 99.999%. The science was complex, but its conclusion was simple. Barry Whelpley's genetic material was present at the scene of Julie's murder. The defense struggled against evidence that seemed overwhelming. They questioned the reliability of 50-year-old DNA samples and argued that genetic genealogy, while innovative, was too new to be fully trusted in capital cases. They painted Whelpley as a confused elderly man being railroaded by prosecutors eager to close a notorious cold case. But the most powerful testimony came from Julie's sister, now 73 herself, who spoke directly to the jury about the impact of her sister's murder on their family. "We've lived with this hole in our lives for 50 years, she said, her voice steady despite tears. "We buried our parents without them ever knowing who killed their daughter. This trial can't bring Julie back, but it can finally give our family the truth we've been seeking since 1972. On April 8, 2022, the jury returned its verdict after deliberating for 6 hours. Barry Lee Whelpley was found guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Julie Ann Hansen. The word guilty echoed through the courtroom like a bell that had been ringing silently for 50 years, finally allowed to sound. Judge Williams sentenced Whelpley to natural life in prison, acknowledging the unusual circumstances of prosecuting a crime committed half a century earlier. While this court cannot restore the years of uncertainty and grief suffered by the victim's family, she said, it can ensure that justice, though delayed, is finally served. Police showed no emotion as he was led away in shackles, his journey from freedom to imprisonment taking him past the front row, where Julie's family sat crying tears that carried both grief and relief. At 77, he would almost certainly die in prison, his remaining years measured not in freedom, but in concrete cells and locked doors. Outside the courthouse, Julie's sister spoke to the assembled media one final time. "Our family has waited 50 years for this day," she said. "We're grateful to everyone who never gave up on Julie's case, the police officers, the scientists, the community members who kept her memory alive. But mostly, we're grateful that we finally know the truth." Julie's case became a landmark in the field of cold case investigation, proving that forensic genetic genealogy could solve crimes that had seemed unsolvable. Her story was featured in documentary films, true crime podcasts, and law enforcement training seminars as an example of how persistence and evolving technology could triumph over time and silence. In Naperville Cemetery, beneath the oak tree that had grown tall and strong over the decades, Julie's grave received more visitors than it had in years. Her headstone, weathered but enduring, continued to bear the simple inscription that now carried new meaning: Julie Ann Hansen, beloved daughter, 1957-1972. Below those dates, someone had placed a small bronze plaque that read simply, "Justice served 2022."